Buenas tardes. La Facultad de Música de la Universidad Autónoma de Nuevo León se congratula en recibirlos a este octavo Festival Composición UANL. Esta tarde vamos a arrancar con el festival con la presencia del maestro Philip Grange, que nos va a hablar acerca de las compositoras británicas. Como ustedes saben, y si no lo saben, la temática de la facultad en este año está referida a las mujeres en la música. Y bueno, si bien es cierto de que a la mujer no se le ha dado el valor que merecen, mucho menos se le ha dado su valor en la música. Y bueno, para eso el maestro Philip Grange nos va a hablar de las compositoras británicas a través del tiempo. Demos la bienvenida al maestro Philip Grange. Dr. Philip Grange, you're welcome once again to the festival. I guess you haven't missed one. And we're glad to have you always here, giving your experience and all your knowledge to our students to make great the world of the composition in our university. Welcome, Mr. Philip Grange, and all the talk is yours.
Thank you. Okay. Can we have the PowerPoint as well? Great, thank you. Good evening, or for everybody in Mexico, good afternoon. I'm going to start by making 3 points about the title of this presentation, British Women Composers. The first is, it is not usual for male composers to give presentations on women composers in the UK. And I have to confess that my presentation will obviously be from a male composer perspective. I can't possibly give it from that of a female composer. The second point is the history of women composers in Britain cannot be separated from the history of British music in general, which is peculiar in that there is a 200-year gap when there was very little significant music written by any British composer, whether male or female. And thirdly, it is not possible to separate the development of concert hall or classical or art music, whatever we want to call it, from issues relating to class and socio-economic background. In other words, how much people earn and how rich they are. The idea of class still casts a shadow over how a person might get on in life in the UK, at least as much as gender, sexual orientation, religion, ethnicity, or any of those other issues. Okay, can we have slide 2, please? This is music up to 1695 I'm going to deal with. So 1695 is significant because it's the year that the composer Henry Purcell died at the young age of 36. And then just a few years later, in 1708, his teacher, John Blow, died as well. And they were the last major British composers for about 200 years. Like so many composers before them, they were indebted to the Chapel Royal for their training and basic livelihood. The Chapel Royal dated back to around 1135, and during this period it was an establishment of clergy and musicians who would travel with the king and queen to provide religious services. This was the most significant source of serious music in England, and it was entirely male. Even the choirs used boy sopranos rather than female ones, and this practice of using boy sopranos continues to this day in certain choirs. For example, King's College Chapel in Cambridge still uses boy sopranos, and it obviously produces a certain type of sound. So during this first important part of England or British musical history up to 1695, there were no women composers. But there were important male composers ranging from John Dunstable in the very late Middle Ages to Thomas Tallis and William Byrd in what we call the Tudor period. This was the period that included King Henry VIII and Queen Elizabeth I. And overall, this era ended, as I say, with Purcell. Three of the composers I mentioned, Tallis, Byrd, and Purcell, were strongly associated with the Chapel Royal. So it just shows you how important it was. However, interestingly, one of Purcell's most famous pieces, the opera Dido and Aeneas, was actually written and premiered at Josiah's Priest's Girls' School in Chelsea in London, most probably in 1688. So by the end of this period, it is absolutely clear that female performers were at least starting to be allowed. Following the death of Purcell, English music became increasingly dominated by composers who came from Europe, particularly Germany. Initially, the most important of these was George Frederick Handel, born in Halle in Germany in 1685, and he was also trained there. He settled in London in 1712, became a British citizen in 1727, and dominated the British musical scene until his death in 1759. So this started a trend that tended to favour German music and German composers over those who were native to Britain. So the latter part of the 1700s saw trips by Haydn, and of course his London symphonies were premiered here, and Mozart. And the next century saw composers like Carl Maria von Weber visit Britain for major performances, and then Mendelssohn made no fewer than 10 trips to England and Scotland. The latter country, that's Scotland, influencing some of his most famous pieces, such as the Overture of Fingal's Cave and his Third Symphony, called The Scottish. Mendelssohn's oratorios, like Elijah and St. Paul, were very popular in Britain, as they continued the tradition started by Handel's Messiah and were performed by amateur choirs, which were populated by the new affluent middle class that were growing throughout the country. Unlike Handel, Mendelssohn did not become a British citizen, but like Handel, he did become involved with the royal family. In his case, this was Queen Victoria and her husband, Prince Albert. By the time of Mendelssohn's death in 1847, British music was thoroughly dominated by German music. This was not unusual, as many countries in Europe were in a similar position. The most notable exceptions being France and Italy, which had very strong musical traditions of their own. Rather disparagingly, some German commentators referred to Britain as the land without music. This was not true, of course. For a start, there was a lot of music by German composers, such as Handel and Mendelssohn. There were also British composers, but perhaps arguably none of them were of the stature or significance of their German counterparts. And, importantly, none were women. Where Britain did excel creatively during this period was in terms of its writers. Could we go to the next slide, please? Slide 3. Particularly with regard to novelists. and many of the most significant novelists were women. They include the likes of, as you can see there, Jane Austen, Elizabeth Gaskell, Charlotte Bronte, and George Eliot. There are also others there. So if I were teaching a course on 19th century English literature, it would be perverse to omit these figures, as they constitute some of the greatest writers in the English language. However, of course, that is looking back on things. At the time, they did not necessarily find things easy. Jane Austen published her work anonymously, and as can be seen, a number of these writers published using male names, which were not their name. Although in one case, the case of George Eliot, this was as much to do with her desire to separate her novel writing from her work as an editor and translator. Interestingly, those who did use their own names were usually married, so they had their husband's surname. Can we go back to slide 2 now, please? Back to slide 2. No, backwards. Back. Yeah, thanks. Okay. In the second half of the 1800s, there was a movement to re-establish a British musical tradition. Again, this was similar to other countries in Europe. It was known as nationalism. So in Britain, there was a growing awareness of Britain's musical past. And so an example of this is in 1876, the Purcell Society was established. There was also the establishment of music conservatoires, so the Royal Academy of Music in 1822 and the Royal College of Music in 1882, both in London. And then there was a whole movement to collect English folk songs, particularly Vaughan Williams was famous for being involved in this. And this was important because they were dying out as a result of people leaving the countryside in order to get work in the factories. But all these things contributed to re-establishing what became known as the British musical Renaissance. However, there was still a considerable influence of German music, and the struggle between being influenced by German music or trying to find something that was English can be exemplified by the two major composers who emerged from this Renaissance. The first, Elgar, 1857 to 1934, was a self-taught composer who developed a musical language that could use a folk song element, but harmonically and motivically was indebted to German music. And indeed, he steeped himself in German music, particularly Schumann, Brahms, Wagner, and Liszt, when he visited Leipzig in the 1880s. He first came to prominent attention in 1899 with his orchestral work, The Enigma Variations. And it was Richard Strauss's endorsement of his work, again, German composer, in 1902, that was a signal of full international recognition. By contrast, Vaughan Williams, who was of a later generation, came through a more academic route, studying with Charles Stanford at the Royal College of Music and, for a short while, with Ravel in France. His big breakthrough piece, Fantasia on a Theme of Thomas Tallis of 1910, brought together English folk song-inspired melodies with a theme taken from Thomas Tallis. This renaissance of British music also saw the first woman composer, Ethel Smythe. Can we go to slide 4, please? Yep, that's it. Thank you. Okay, Ethel Smythe belonged to Elgar's generation, being born in 1858. And her music is more aligned with the German-influenced side of British music. Indeed, she studied at the Leipzig Conservatory, where she met Dvorak, Grieg, and Tchaikovsky. As the first British woman composer of note, she sometimes had a difficult time being accepted, but she also did have considerable success. Her opera, The Wreckers, was well received, and her second opera, Der Wald, was performed in 1903 at the Met in New York, the only work by a woman composer ever done there until Sarajevo's L'amour de loin over 100 years later in 2016. The record provides a good example of Smythe's German-influenced music. In this case, Wagner is clearly the influence. It was Ethel Smythe's third opera and her most famous, ambitious and monumental one. It is in 3 acts and uses large musical resources. It was inspired by a walking holiday she took in Cornwall in 1886, during which she came across folk stories of villagers luring ships onto the rocks to plunder their cargo. So hence they were wrecking the boats, so that's why they were called the wreckers. Attempts to secure a French language production proved fruitless, so the opera was translated into German and first performed in Leipzig in 1906. And then 3 years later, it had its English premiere. So can we just go to slide 5 for a minute, please? Okay, it's a map of Britain. If you go down to the right to the bottom corner on the left-hand side of Britain, where it says, I think, Penzance, that is Cornwall. So it's that thin strip of land at the end there. And it's very atmospheric down there. Obviously, it's surrounded by sea on 3 sides. So it's there where Ethel Smythe went for this holiday and where she first conceived of this opera. Okay, can we go back up to the previous slide? Thank you. So I'm going to play you Prelude to the second act, which is called On the Cliffs of Cornwall, which has enjoyed success as a concert piece independently of the opera. So can we play that particular YouTube clip, please? Okay, shall we stop there, please? Thank you. It gives you a good idea of her sort of sound world and who it was indebted to. In 1912, Ethel Smythe joined the suffragette movement. This movement was a women's movement that was basically trying to get women the vote, which they didn't have. And it was founded around the beginning of the 1900s. And some of them took to doing more active things in order to try and get attention, so that the idea of women having the vote would be brought to people's attention. And one of these things was to break MPs, those are lawmakers, windows of their houses by throwing stones at them. Ethel Smythe participated in this and was put in prison for 2 months. So she was very much something of a trailblazer, both as a composer and for women's rights. But it wasn't all bad for her, because in 1922 she was actually made what's known as a Dame Commander. This is the equivalent of being called Sir if you're a man. So she became Dame Ethel Smythe, which is an acknowledgement by the establishment of her contribution to music in Britain. And Sir Thomas Beecham, the great conductor, directed a festival of her work to celebrate her 75th birthday. So she was receiving quite a few accolades. However, by then she had gone deaf. Indeed, between 1919, when she went deaf, and 1940, she actually devoted her energies to writing books. And she completed 10 during that time, mostly autobiographical in nature. However, she certainly received much more recognition than the next generation, which included composers like Rebecca Clark, Dorothy Gow, and Ina Boyle. After them, the next generation of women composers were born around the beginning of the 20th century, and that does include some very significant figures. Could we go to slide 6, please? So there you can see Rebecca Clark, Dorothy Gow, and Ina Boyle, who were more of Vaughan Williams's generation. And then the next are those who were born at the beginning of the 20th century: Preo Rainier, Elizabeth Lutyens, Grace Williams, Elizabeth McConkie, and Imogen Holst. Now, nearly all these women studied at the Royal College of Music, and many of them actually with Vaughan Williams in the 1920s. And some, like Lutyens, McConkie, Gow, and Williams, were all there at the same time. So there was actually now a sort of a group of women composers starting to emerge. Now, of all these composers, Elizabeth Lutyens and Elizabeth McConkie are perhaps the most significant. Can we go to slide 7, please? Okay. Elizabeth Lutyens was the daughter of Edwin Lutyens, who was a very famous architect, and her mother was a member of the aristocracy. She is credited with being the first British composer to use serialism, with her Chamber Concerto No. 1 in 1939. As a result, she became known as 12-Tone Lizzie, although ironically, she was to make most of her money as a composer writing film scores, usually for British horror movies. And at the bottom there on that slide, I've given you some of the movies that she wrote music for. And in recent years, there have been some CDs of that music. The piece I'm going to play you of hers is called Au Saison au Château, and it was her first ever commission to write a piece of concert music. And she received that commission in 1946. It's a cantata setting a poem by Rimbaud for soprano, guitar, mandolin, harp, violin, and strings. At its premiere in 1947, the work was a great success and was even encored. So could we play that particular piece, please? Lasts about 6 minutes. Okay, should we stop there, please? Thank you. So as I said, that piece was very well received at its premiere and was even encored. However, Liz Lutyens did not always receive such adulation. As can be seen from this review, can we go to the next slide, please? This review, which appeared in the BBC's The Listener in 1966, following her 60th birthday celebrations, by the critic Stephen Walsh. He puts, Lutyens' music is among the least obviously appealing of any currently being written by leading composers of her generation. To my ears, there has always been an element of dryness about her music, and it doesn't take an anti-feminist to suggest that it may have something to do with her sex. Female creative artists have always been rare, even in literature, the most immediate of the arts. While in music, at least, the gap between men and women in performance is small, if indeed it exists. Here again, it is most measurable at the very top, where interpretation fades into visionary genius, a quality which is demonstrably anti-feminine. And with Lutyens, even in maturity, it remains true that her music often makes structural points which are hamstrung by the ordinariness of her creative thought. I have to admit, when I came across that review, I was really shocked. Obviously, it's very unpolitically correct in terms of our sensitivities today, but I was also shocked by the sheer inaccuracy of some of the things. For example, to say that it was rare for women to participate in literature. One of the reasons I also included that big list of famous women novelists from the 19th century is because that just shows there were plenty of really good women, involved in literature in Britain. Also, the idea that women can't be a genius is just ridiculous. And also, there've been plenty of really great women performers. So it's one thing for this critic to not like the music. That's sort of fair enough if he doesn't. But then to blame it on her gender, her sex, is, I think, something we would find intolerable today, and rightly so. But it is nonetheless something that clearly Elizabeth Lutyens found herself having to put up with. The dislike of the music may be partly due to the fact that she did like sparse textures, because she liked sparse textures, because she disliked what she regarded as the overblown music of composers like Mahler. Anyway, that as it may be, it's still an inappropriate type of review, I think. Okay, Elizabeth McConkie, can we go to the next one, please? The next slide. Elizabeth McConkie was a prolific composer and is now known primarily for her chamber music, which includes a cycle of 13-string quartets, and also her orchestral music. Although she wrote a number of operas and ballets, she helped promote the cause of composers in the UK through chairing various organisations, and she was very important in doing that. For instance, in 1959, she became chair of the Composers Guild of Great Britain, the first woman to ever hold that position. She was also president of the Society for the Promotion of New Music. And like Ethel Smythe, she was made a dame for her services to music in 1987. Elizabeth McConkie had two daughters, the second of which, Nicola Lefnu, who was born in 1947, is a major composer in her own right, particularly known for her theatre works. She has been involved in teaching as well and was professor of music at the University of York, which has always been famous for its composition work. And she was head of department there from 1994 to 2001. She eventually retired from teaching in 2008, but continues to live in York and work as a composer. So, the period between World War I and World War II saw the situation for women improve in terms of opportunities and rights. For instance, women were granted the right to vote in 1928. And that was no doubt due to the efforts of the suffragettes before World War I and the fact that women had taken on many roles usually done by men during that war. However, another way of looking at the situation, especially in the context of a country like Britain, which has a strong class structure, is that those women or men who went on to study music were primarily from well-off middle-class backgrounds. The possibility that such opportunities might be available to all would not happen until after World War II, where the increasing expansion of education opened up possibilities for those from working class backgrounds to become composers. So, for instance, a composer like Peter Maxwell Davies was one who would benefit from that because he came from a very working class background. Okay, could we go on to the next slide, please? So today, women composers are represented in every type of music, including concert hall, classical, whatever you want to call it, opera, film, electroacoustic, etc. And like their male counterparts, can come from all areas of society, all classes. There are too many now for me to list, so I thought I'd just come up with this particular list here. And apologies to any composers in my home country that I've missed out, and I'm sure I've missed out plenty. And I'll just concentrate on 4 of the younger composers and say a little bit more about them. So they come from different, the 4 I've chosen come from very different generations, and also they represent very different areas of music. So the first, can we go on to the next slide, please? Thank you. Is Judith Weir, who was born in 1954 in Scotland, and she is currently Master of the Queen's Music. So we actually have a woman in the top ceremonial post in Britain. But she is in fact the first woman ever to hold that post, and that post was established in 1626. Her music is characterized by wit and humor, something that is quite rare in music these days. She's written for all sorts of ensembles, but it was her opera A Night at the Chinese Opera of 1987 that really brought her to the attention of the wider public. One of her most famous pieces is a 10-minute opera in 3 acts for a solo soprano, and it's called King Harold's Saga. It was originally written for the soprano Jane Manning, and who has to sing all the roles. So the roles include King Harold of Norway, Old Tostig, who's an English traitor, Harold's dead brother, Saint Olaf, who appears to the king in a dream, Harold's 2 wives. She has to sing the whole of the Norwegian army, a soldier who survives the battle at Stamford Bridge, and an Icelandic sage. So already you get a sense of the type of humour that she's into, because one person singing all of that is on one level quite ridiculous, really. The opera relates the invasion by Norwegian forces of England in 1066. And they were defeated by King Harold, who then went on to fight William the Conqueror and lost to him a few weeks later. I'm going to play you the opening act where King Harold boasts of all his military victories, and then Tostig turns up and persuades him to invade England, knowing that it will end in disaster. So can we play this particular example, please? Can it be louder?
Field of battle. To a fanfare of trumpets, Earl Tostig arrives from England. Tostig is a traitor. He persuades King Harold to invade England. I, Harold, by the grace of Almighty God, King of all the northern lands, mightiest warrior that ever donned a coat of mail and held a sharp-edged sword, strongest king that ever strode along ship's prow and sailed the restless sea. Most merciless fighter that ever killed a living man. Whereas my brother, the blessed and holy man, Olaf the saint, said, love thine enemies. I say, sever their limbs until they cause no trouble. When I was young, I raided endless Russia. My ship sailed past Byzantium. I scourged the Saracen men in Sicily. I trod the holy ground of Palestine. They knew my justice on both banks of the Jordan. Wherever I went, men said, may his soul abide in Christ. All around the orb of the world, my name is filled by this name unknown. Harold the Merciless. Hail Tostig. Tell all Tostig. Tell us your tale, tall Tostig.
Can we stop and have the next slide, thanks? Thank you. Oh, yeah, next slide. Great. So if Judith Weir's music represents the mainstream, then Rebecca Saunders, born in 1967 and belonging to the next generation, is more aligned with European modernism. And indeed, like new complexity composers such as Brian Ferneyhough and James Dillon, she lives abroad. In her case, she lives in Berlin. Saunders' music is characterized by limited pitch material and a wide breadth of timbral complexity. She is fascinated with resonance and extraneous noises created by instruments, such as the scratch of a bow, the thud of the pedals of a piano or harp, and the taps and slides of the left hand on a string instrument's fingerboard. So the example I thought I'd play to you, which would give you a very good idea of her ear for very nuanced timbres, is one of her lockdown tapes. So she wrote it as a result of the coronavirus 19 lockdowns. This is number 4 for solo percussion. Okay, can we stop there, please? And have the final slide. Thanks. So the final composer, just to say a little bit about, is Elaine Michener. She describes herself as an experimental vocalist, movement artist, and composer whose work encompasses improvisation, contemporary music theatre, and performance art. She was born in East London to Jamaican parents, and a lot of her work explores this Black Jamaican heritage. A good example of this is the piece Sweet Tooth, about Britain's role in the use of slaves in the sugar trade. She writes, "My ancestry includes enslaved Africans sold by Africans to British traders to make Britain great, through the slave trade of sugar on plantations in the Caribbean and Brazil." So Sweet Tooth is a 50-minute piece divided into 6 chapters, which are given there. And it takes its text from extracts from traditional Jamaican plantation chants, other songs, inventories by plantation owners, etc., etc. So I'm just going to play the opening 4 minutes or so of this piece. And Elaine Michener enters herself just after 3 minutes into this. Can we stop, please? Thank you. Okay, so that's been very much a brief introduction to some British women composers. I tried to give you a sense of the breadth of what people are doing, but also place it into some context, which is the fact that, you know, obviously they've only been on the scene for the last 150 years, when in fact British music goes back about 1,000 years, but then it does have a big gap in the middle. Anyway, I have made the PowerPoint available for anybody who would like it, so that you can look up any of those pieces or any of those other names and the work by those composers. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Phil. It's always amusing, your lectures, and especially this one, in which it is centered on women, which somehow they haven't get the place they deserve through history. And I don't know, this last piece was amazing for what it means, not only the performance, but what it means, you know, the
sure.
meaning of the or the thematic subject. Anyway, I want to thank you because, you, as I say at the beginning, you've been through all the festivals since the first one back in 1913, I think. I mean 2013. Sorry. Yeah. Well, and Diego Vasquez say excellent, and in the comments. Para la gente que haya presenciado la plática, conferencia del maestro Phil, siéntanse libres para hacer preguntas, para hacer comentarios o preguntas en sí, ¿no? Eric Guerrero says, great conference, lots of music to listen to. Thanks, Dr. Phil Grange and Dr. Ricardo Martinez. There it is. And Daniel Cepeda says, where can we find the playlist? Keep in touch with Mr. Grange. Want to say something, Phil?
I was only going to say that the pieces that I've been played, all the links to them are on the PowerPoint, and I'm quite happy for the PowerPoint to be made available to the students, you know, if they want to download it or have it sent to them or whatever.
Jorge, what can we do about this? Jorge. Ok. Facultad de Música. Puedes descargar la presentación del Dr. Phil Grange en la siguiente link. Alejandro Morales says also excellent job, new music styles for listening. La señorita Mandalore says, how is this possible that a lot of women of the 17th, the century, playing piano as part of their education at home, but they didn't compose music? Where they publish it? I don't know, I guess that's a couple of questions still.
Well, as well, of course, in Britain there weren't any composers doing very much so at that time. So whether they were male or female, but in Germany there were some, like Fanny Mendelssohn, Mendelssohn's sister. She did write pieces. Like there's a very good piano trio that does get done actually now. But I think they were very, how can I put it? They were just not allowed to have that sort of stage. And I mean, it's a very good point. They played piano, many of them. Many of them also sung, of course, but they weren't taken that seriously. I think that's the thing. But there were some composers, but not in Britain, but in other European countries, particularly Germany. Yeah.
Ok. BRVJ0 dice gracias. Daniel Cepeda también dice gracias. Thanks. ¿Alguien más? Adriana Martínez Tobar, thanks, Dr. Philip Grange. Excellent conference. I don't know, Alicia, ¿te quedó claro la pregunta que hiciste? ¿Quedó contestadas? Señorita Mandalore. Ok. Si no hay nada más, Diego Vázquez, thanks for the valuable information. Bueno, pues por ahí no me queda más que agradecer para cerrar este primer evento, o con el evento con el que se abre este 8º Festival Composición UANL. Darle las gracias al doctor Philip Grange porque siempre ha estado presente en los festivales y siempre es interesante los puntos de vista del doctor. Phil, we just want to say thank you for your invaluable lecture and all the lectures that you have been done through the years in contribution to the festival. Thanks again, and hope to have you in future festivals.
Well, it'd be a pleasure to be involved.
And hopefully we'll be live next festivals. So it will be a pleasure to have you in person in here.
Well, I would like that too. Yeah, that would be great.
Well, thank you so much. And I think with this, we conclude the conference of the Dr. Philip Grange.